So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Delta EE SmartEn webinar. While we're just waiting for people to join, I'm going to launch a poll, which I'd like people to respond to, asking how many of these annual webinars have you attended so far? So thank you for all your responses. Over 60% of the audience say this is your first webinar that you've joined. So thank you for joining. We're pleased to have you with us. Of the rest is fairly evenly split between 1, 2, and more than 2. So thank you everyone who's attended every one of these report launches so far. And thank you all for joining us and sparing some time on what is turning out to be a somber day. Our immediate thoughts are with the people of Ukraine. However, the events do have long-term implications for energy security, for the energy transition, and beyond, and will have an impact for years and for decades. And in this future where we are less reliant on fossil fuels than today, demand side flexibility is going to play an increasingly important role, and the progress towards enabling demand side flexibility in energy markets is going to only grow in importance. Next slide, please. So we're very proud today to launch the report, our third annual market monitor on demand side flexibility in Europe. So we're going to introduce the report and how we went about producing it, highlight how we've assessed in a number of different ways the development of demand side flexibility across Europe, and then delve in a little more detail to one of the countries that's getting a lot of attention, but is perhaps one of the most contentious and debated countries that we investigated as a team. If you have any questions or comments, then please use the chat and question function in GoToWebinar, and we will leave time at the end for discussion and responding to questions. And the report itself will be emailed to everyone who's registered at the end of the webinar. The production of the report has been a long effort over a number of months by the team presenting today, and it's with pleasure that I will ask Andres Pintobello to introduce SmartEn and the team that worked on it from their side.
Yes, thank you, John. Well, thanks everybody first for attending, of course, this webinar. It's always a pleasure to see so many interested people in demand side flexibility and the developments across Europe. So as John was saying, this is a cooperation that we've been doing now for the third edition. which brings us, well, for those of you that don't know, this market monitor is really a thorough effort of trying to understand what is possible right now in Europe for demand-side flexibility, but also to understand what where this is going, right? Which is not always easy nowadays, and especially on in 27 or 28 different countries. So from us, from SmartEn side, the work has been, or the people involved, it's been myself, but also very importantly Cinzia, which will who will present later on one of our country spotlights. For those that don't know SmartEn, we're a business association based in Brussels, and we cover all topics or all aspects from the demand side of the energy sector. So if you go to the next slide, you can get this glimpse of our members. As you can see, they cover from energy, large energy consumers to technology providers, aggregators, and really all participants in this energy transition from the demand side. And I can pass on to you, John, to introduce Delta.
Thank you. So I'm John Ferris, Head of the Flexibility and Energy Storage Research Service at Delta EE. And we're joined on the webinar today by Lucy Murley, the Manager of the Flexibility Research Service, who will also be presenting later on. So for those who don't know Delta EE, we are a specialist research and consulting company working across Europe to help our customers develop strategies, business models, and customer propositions to navigate the energy transition. If you move to the next slide, please. We offer a range of research services, whether it's around the home energy management and connected homes, new energy business models. We have a particular specialization in heat, whether it's the electrification of heat and the development and trends in gas heating service, moving into hydrogen, EV, and the flexibility and storage research service from within which this report is produced. So if we move on to the next slide, we will launch our second poll, and we'll keep it open for about a minute. Asking you, the audience, where do you expect to see most growth in demand-side flexibility by 2030? In which region? So thank you all for your responses. 85% of you voted in that poll, and the region expected to see most growth with 42% was Northwest Europe. Central and Southern Europe second with 28%, but only 4% expected to see most growth in Eastern Europe. I think we'll come back to these results, once we've presented the report and our findings. So next slide, please. So we'll go straight on to introducing the market monitor. And as we've already highlighted, it's been a team effort over a number of months to research over 30 countries with detailed assessment into 12. We've been engaged in interviews with over 100 contacts across the industry, and we'd like to thank everyone who contributed to our research. We've also gathered over 40 gigabytes of market data to analyze the trends in volume and prices in flexibility markets this year. And while we publish at a high level the public report that everyone is going to be receiving after this webinar, we also produce a number of detailed assessments of the 12 countries listed that are exclusive to SmartEn members and Delta EE subscribers. And we'll be showing a snapshot of what that includes later on. Just moving to the next slide, and this is the first map. So overall, it's a fairly similar picture to last year's map. And the overall message is that there's been progress in enabling demand-side flexibility, but nowhere near enough. We've assessed each country against 4 broad criteria. Firstly, regulatory progress to enable demand-side flexibility, with a particular focus on the clean energy package. Secondly, the development of local flexibility markets and energy communities, whether it's TSO markets, other local energy markets, or collective self-consumption. Thirdly, we've quantified the potential market size of flexibility, the value that should be available and accessible to the demand side. And finally, we've taken a look at future developments of flexibility, where we're looking at plans and programs where there are clear changes that are coming in the next few years. And the highlights really are that although TSO spend on flexibility nearly trebled last year, a huge increase in spend that is being incurred by consumers, insufficient progress has been made to enable demand-side flexibility, both to participate and to reduce the overall costs to consumers. The implementation of the clean energy package is a start, but has been slow. And already in some countries, we're seeing it's inadequate, and we're seeing countries go beyond the requirements. And over the next decade, increased renewable ambition with recent announcements from France, Germany, and the UK in particular, will increase the needs for flexibility. So the importance is only going to grow. Next slide, please. So I will hand over now to Andres, where we'll start to explore some of these maps and some of these areas in more detail.
Yes, thank you, John. So the first map that we looked into, or that you can see right now, is the one on regulatory progress. And for this part, we looked at different aspects of how regulation developments have allowed the participation of demand-side flexibility resources in all the markets. But the main points, or the main aspects that really dictate its participation is, well, first, is demand-side flexibility even allowed to participate in different markets, and not only ancillary services, but wholesale markets and capacity mechanisms, resource adequacy. So really a broad spectrum of markets we looked into. So can demand-side flexibility actually participate? Is it excluded? There are very few markets that actually explicitly limit that, in particular when we're talking about TSO markets, so more ancillary services, that explicitly exclude it. However, this doesn't mean that demand-side flexibility actually participates, because there are different ways of implicitly limiting access to different markets, and we will see those a bit later. And then the second point that I would highlight is aggregation. So the competitive advantage of demand-side flexibility comes really from being able to aggregate numerous smaller resources that are distributed across a wide geographic area. So we've really moved away from the previous status quo, where you have, or where you know where your energy resource is, your large power plant, right? So you can only really extract all this benefits from all these resources if you allow properly aggregation. And the limiting factor here is the implementation of an aggregator framework across Europe that is homogeneous and really inclusive. And why is this so important? So the implementation of the regulation has been quite tricky so far. You see that you have on this maps, you have more or less in some countries quite homogeneous colors, but this doesn't mean that all countries are equally advanced in all aspects, because this is a composite representation of the situation, right? So the devil is really in the details, and currently the main avenues for demand-side flexibility are really in TSO markets. So it's mostly in ancillary services, where demand-side flexibility participates mostly, more or less, around in half of these markets. But there's very limited participation in wholesale or resource adequacy mechanisms. So, and this reason is because of this uneven adoption of the existing regulation. As technology evolves, in particular regarding prosumers, we're seeing fragmentation of the European market. So essentially, prosumers in one country don't have the same opportunities as prosumers in a different country, or prosumers or active customers. And by that, I mean active customers that are across all segments, so not only residential, but also commercial and industrial. And one of the main issues first is because the aggregator framework has been implemented in different ways, if at all, across Europe, but also the way that we're dealing with technology neutrality has been very different. So technology neutrality as a term can be understood in different ways. It can mean not to exclude explicitly the participation of a resource, but there are a lot of ways to then implicitly limit the participation of these technologies. This can come from testing requirements, high metering requirements, the minimum bid sizes of the different products, the activation times. These vary significantly across Europe, and are one of the main limiting factors for the participation of demand-side flexibility. So really what we should be striving for in the regulation is more technology inclusivity rather than technology neutrality, because as we've seen through neutrality, it's just very easy to actually limit the participation. And I'm saying this not because we want or we should see demand-side flexibility for demand-side flexibility's sake in the different products across Europe. That's not the goal, not to have demand-side flexibility, but to properly value it as an alternative that is both reliable and cost-effective. And as we see right now, the participation or the requirements do not allow it to participate on an equal footing with traditional generation. It's not really properly an alternative to these resources. So we see this is really uneven field. And how to get there, that's a bit of a trickier question. First, of course, the full implementation of the clean energy package or the electricity market design should be given, of course, but we need a more decisive approach from the system side, and including demand-side flexibility as a resource for system operators. And just yesterday, we saw the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, ACER, rejecting the European TSOs proposal for the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. One of the reasons being precisely that the value of demand response is not adequately recognized in the modeling for future mechanisms. So we need this kind of forward thinking, not only from regulators, but also from system operators, to really include demand side response or demand side resources in not only the modeling exercises, but also in their planning, in the grid planning, in the future plans, because it's the only way that then, if you include it like that, that you can then make these legislative changes that will allow or give the proper market signals for demand side resources to participate. And this you see especially also when you go, or this need for this forward-looking way, you see this when you go into the next map that we looked into, that focuses on local flexibility. And,
Andreas, do you mind if I quickly jump in before I move slides? For the benefit of the audience, would you mind just briefly explaining what a BRP is?
Yes, so the BRP is the Balance Responsible Party, and in some countries there is a requirement for aggregators, or even in some cases the individual consumer to be the Balance Responsible Party, which can increase costs and make it so that it's less interesting for people to participate with their flexibility. So like I was saying, the local flexibility markets, so when we go into the second level in the regulation and see what is actually available for local consumers, and we have to be aware that the biggest chunk of flexibility is going to be on local level. I mean, this is where the biggest opportunity lies. So it is even more important to get this right in legislation to really allow these consumers to benefit, and also the system to benefit from this flexibility. And what we're seeing here is that development of local flexibility is really lagging behind. We only see proper markets in two countries, in the UK and in the Netherlands. Other than that, we've only seen development of local flexibility procurement on pilot levels, on pilot projects. And together with the development of local flexibility is the development of citizen energy communities, which should play a significant role in these local flexibility markets. And there we also see that the implementation of the framework that the clean energy package presented is quite uneven. We have countries that provide different rights and opportunities for active consumers. Mostly what is allowed is really limited to self-consumption or on-site optimization, so really a detached participation from the grid. It's really, energy communities are seen as more as energy cooperatives that have a closed off participation, really, and no interaction whatsoever with the energy markets, and also not on peer-to-peer trading, which is quite at an infant stage. So overall, the current regulatory framework has proven to be insufficiently implemented, and maybe even insufficient at all to further develop local flexibility markets. And I'm not going to hold up the presentation more. I'm happy to respond to any questions on both these topics later on, but we can move on to the next slides.
Thank you, Andreas. So the next slide that we have here is an indication of the potential market size of flexibility, and it's a new map that we introduced for this year's iteration of the Market Monitor. Before I go into a bit more detail about what the map shows, I'd like to stress that this is the potential market size of flexibility, not necessarily that of demand-side flexibility. So the map you see here is an indication of the spend that a TSO made in ancillary services. And we calculated that through collecting data on the availability and utilization prices and volumes. And through that data collection, we were able to indicate the total spend and therefore the total addressable market of flexibility, which, if all things in the CEP are properly implemented, and as what Andreas was saying, we have more of a open and accessible market, theoretically, this is what a demand-side flexibility asset could have a potential piece of the pie. Overall, 5 countries account for approximately 60% of this total spend on ancillary services across Europe, and they are France, Germany, GB, Italy, and Spain. And last year in 2021, they each spent over 500 million on ancillary services. Spain, Italy spent just over $1 billion. Just to show you the scale that TSOs are spending. And this also doesn't include potential spend on things like the wholesale market or imbalance. This is just on your ancillary services. Broadly speaking, there are sort of two buckets of these high spenders. You have those markets that there are multiple value streams that can provide revenue through flexibility. For example, GB or France. When we did this analysis specifically in the GB market, we also included the newer value streams such as dynamic containment. In these markets, there are multiple avenues for flexibility, but the volumes in them vary quite considerably. And sort of the second bucket you have are those markets that have a relatively high spend, but have less value streams in which you could monetize your flexibility. Of the high spenders, examples sort of Italy and France, sorry, not Italy and France, Italy and Spain. And then also Poland is another country where, despite having limited regulatory and openness to demand-side flexibility, does have quite a high spend due to sort of the geographical size of the country. What I think is most interesting about this map is when you compare it to the first map that Andreas spoke about and the regulatory and openness of demand-side flexibility. When put side by side, for example, you can identify Spain, which Cinzia will go into a bit more detail later, but it's a good way of highlighting markets that have a large spend from the TSO, so therefore you can infer a greater need for flexibility, but on the other hand, are quite exclusionary for demand-side flexibility. And these markets are very interesting for us to look at and show where the most need and the most effort from a regulatory perspective needs to be put in to enable this value to be accessed by more than just sort of your large-scale thermal plants and or the odd front-of-meter battery. And that sort of leads quite nicely into our final map on the future development of flexibility and where we see the most activity in the coming years. To make this map, we looked at 4 core things. What I just mentioned previously about the total market size and the spend on ancillary services. We looked at renewable targets and compared those with the current renewable generation as of 2021. And we also looked at market coupling. So are these markets either have already joined or have a implementation to join Mary Picasso, TER, or the Common SCR Corporation? And finally, and arguably most importantly, do these countries have a legal framework or a plan to open to demand-side flexibility in the coming years? I think it's quite interesting looking at this map compared to the poll results that we did at the beginning of this webinar. So as you can see, there are sort of three bunches of future development, which map sort of nicely onto your Central Eastern European 28%, and then the 42% that suggested Northwest Europe would be good countries to move into. So as I said, there are 3 large groups. The first ones are those that, unfortunately, at the moment are not accessible to demand-side flexibility, but have legislative plans in place to enable this. Key ones being Greece and Poland. They have a relatively large TSO spend. They have also relatively large renewable targets, and their TSOs are working progressively to open up in the next couple of years before 2025, which is our cutoff year. The next segment you have are those markets that are legally open, so that is a positive, but due to one reason or another are prohibitive to demand-side flexibility. That might be due to minimum bid sizes, due to technology requirements, aggregation limits. So from a surface, it's positive, but in practicality, there is very little monetization or sort of accessibility to demand-side flexibility. And those are the countries the likes of Spain and Italy that I keep mentioning, and also Portugal. So we're very much hoping in the next couple of years that the legislation makes that jump between legally open and then accessible and monetized. And then the final segment that personally I thought was quite interesting was the group of the more open and accessible markets that still have a lot of room to grow. Those primarily being Germany, France, and GB, where relative to other countries they are open and accessible. They have such high renewable targets by 2030. There's still significant room to both develop and increase the volume of demand-side flexibility, but also make additional steps to make it more accessible. Like Andreas was saying, that could be in terms of more local flexibility. It could be in terms of enabling more energy communities. So we don't want to say these countries have done it all and all they need to do is increase their renewables. But there is definitely room to grow in these markets, despite the fact that they are already open. And then my final point for this slide is maybe to highlight the countries that we think are maybe not less likely to develop demand-side flexibility, but are less likely to be future growth markets by 2025. A lot of the Eastern European countries are looking at other European countries to develop, but it's just likely to take a little bit longer than 2025. And we're expecting that these countries will mature a little bit more when the common markets are implemented and there is clear strategies to join them. And finally, the last little cluster is the Nordics in Northern Europe. Again, they are relatively open and accessible, but they also already have high renewable generation, and therefore the growth potential is less. And also, if you couple that with them joining the coupled markets, it means that the need for flexibility in those markets is less likely to grow compared to, say, Italy, Spain, or Greece or Poland. And on that note, I will hand you back to John.
So thank you very much, both of you, for that interesting overview of the maps. I think I found it particularly interesting this year that each map shows a slightly different perspective on the development of flexibility across 30 countries. Now, the maps will be they are in the report, which will be emailed to everyone who's registered for the webinar after the webinar ends, which is one of the questions that has come in. I can see other questions are coming in for the Q&A session at the end. So please, if you do have any questions, do ask them through the Q&A function while we go on to our last set of slides. So this is a glimpse of the extra information that is provided to SmartEn members and Delta EE flexibility subscribers. We've mentioned a number of times that Spain has a high spend on flexibility, but limited participation. And it would seem a huge opportunity as a large market to reduce costs for consumers by engaging the demand side, particularly at a part of the continent that has relatively limited interconnection with the rest of Europe, and therefore a high need for flexibility. And yet, in the poll that we launched earlier, only 10% saw Spain and Portugal as the region seeing the most growth in demand side flexibility. So I will hand over now to Cinzia and Lucy to explore whether that is the case. And I think I must say that in our discussions between us, I think Spain has been the most contentious, challenging and disputed country to analyse.
Yes, thank you, John. So as was already mentioned before, in this market monitor, we included 12 country reports. And in these country reports, we provide more detailed information on the progress of demand-side flexibility in each market. And so these country reports are only available to SmartEn members and Delta E subscribers. So the country that we would like to focus on and present to you today is Spain, because indeed is a very interesting country. It has a great potential for flexibility, and this is indeed due to limited interconnection with the rest of Europe and the high targets for renewable generation in 2030. But despite this potential participation, actual participation of demand-side flexibility is still very limited. Indeed, there are different barriers that still limit market participants. Some of them are technical barriers, but mainly what we observed in this report is a very slow regulatory progress. So the first barrier that I would like to mention is the lack of a real framework for independent aggregators. So the process of defining what is the role and what are the responsibilities of independent aggregators has been extremely slow in the past years, and so should not be postponed anymore by the regulator and the system operator, because this really limits participation of demand-side resources in the different markets. In addition to this, participation of demand-side in ancillary services is theoretically allowed. This is what we observed in our report, but in practice is extremely difficult. And barriers include the request to have very large portfolio sizes to provide these services, and with no possibility of aggregating demand and generation. And also the fact that aggregators cannot enter the market without an agreement with the BRP, with the Balance Responsible Party. In addition to that, still remaining on ancillary services, the TSO requests real-time telemetry to participate, and this makes aggregation of small assets extremely difficult and costly. So these barriers exclude, in practice, DSF in Spain And this is mainly why we observe very limited participation at the moment. In terms of resource adequacy mechanism, the Spanish government is working now on a proposal of a new capacity market, and the proposal has been commented already by the regulator and is now back in the hands of the government. A clear timeline has not been provided, but as it is designed now, the proposal foresees some limitation that could exclude smaller demand units. So the new capacity market, as it is proposed now in legislation, would be accessible only to industrial loads. And this would be really a missed opportunity to design a new resource adequacy mechanism in Spain that is really technology inclusive, and so really allows participation of both demand and generation on a level playing field. Moving to the local flexibility aspects that we analyze in the report, in Spain, there are some active pilot projects carried out by different TSOs and market participants. To name a few, Project Coordinate, Electraflex, and also the market operator OMIE is active in some trials, but they are still trials, and activity for local flexibility markets is very limited. So it is important that the new DSO regulatory framework should take into account procurement of flexibility as an alternative to solutions that are already established. One other aspect that we analyze for local flexibility are energy communities, as Lucy said before. And in Spain, a framework for renewable energy communities has already been implemented, while the definition of citizen energy community is still missing. Nevertheless, collective self-consumption is allowed in Spain, and there are some movements, so updates for energy communities are expected in 2022. And then the last bit, residential flexibility. The Spanish case is quite peculiar around Europe because around 1/3 of residential customers are on a regulated default tariff, and this tariff was updated in May to reflect hourly wholesale prices. So a great number of residential customers already could benefit from flexibility through dynamic prices if they are allowed to exploit this their flexibility. So in conclusion, the Spanish market is very interesting and can potentially grow in the near future, but a fast implementation of the clean energy package is necessary because this implementation would already address many of the issues and the barriers that I mentioned before. And in this year market monitor, as Lucy said before, we also analyzed the market value. And so to give you more detailed results on this, I will pass back the floor to Lucy.
Thank you, Cinzia. So yes, so the map I mentioned earlier about the total spend was created through the analysis of utilization, prices, and volumes. That map was for all 30 countries, but for the 12 core countries that we decided to look into in more detail, we also took a historic look at this TSO spend. So first sort of comment on Spain before the general narrative is, as Cinzia said, there's a lot of barriers for demand side flexibility accessing this value. So the prices and volumes of utilization that you see on the screen here, unfortunately large amounts of that isn't accessible or isn't monetized, I should say, by demand side flexibility. Nonetheless, there are some very interesting trends and narratives that can be drawn from this data. Most notably on the left-hand side in the price graph, you will see the significant increase between 2020 and 2021. This is primarily due to the high wholesale costs at the end of Q4 in 2021. I'm sure you're all aware of them, but that had a direct impact on the utilization prices of ancillary services and therefore the total spend that the TSO had to spend. This is not just a narrative that we're seeing in Spain. It's completely across Europe and links back to what John said previously at the beginning of this webinar, with total TSO spend tripling between 2020 and 2021. Other key points to draw from these graphs is that the need to be able to participate in multiple value streams across multiple years. It is no longer possible for a single asset to play in a single value stream and be considered widely successful. It's more about how that asset can participate and gain revenue across multiple value streams in multiple years, which is what you can see here on the volume graph on the right. There's been little increase in volume historically in Spain, but slight variations in the different value streams that make up the total volume. And then my third point, which is maybe more of a food for thought as we bring the webinar to a close, is the overlap between those that participate in ancillary services and those that can potentially participate in the wholesale market. So as I just said, you have more assets participating in more value streams, and that, coupled with the overall trend of reducing imbalance settlement periods to 15 minutes, means there's greater opportunity for assets and service providers, optimizers, aggregators, anyone really in the flexibility space, to overlap participation in ancillary services and participation in the wholesale market, and then gain revenue and monetization from both. This level of overlap is quite nuanced at the moment, and it's not possible in every market due to regulatory barriers, but it is definitely sort of the beginning of a trend that we are seeing at the moment, and definitely something that we will be keeping an eye out as the markets develop and as more elements of the clean energy package is implemented, so these demand side flexibility assets can access both ancillary services and wholesale markets. So on that, I will hand back to John.
Thank you very much, Cinzia and Lucy. So now it's time for questions, and we've had lots coming in. And I think we'll start, I think, Andres, with a question on whether we see a willingness to change or to implement legislation on flexibility. Essentially, I think the question that we're all asking is why has it been so slow? And maybe if you could comment on the role of ACER, both the implications of the rejection of the resource adequacy assessment. Will that provide any impetus for demand side flexibility, or are countries waiting for the network code on flexibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's actually a good question, whether there is willingness to actually change legislation. I've been doing this for a while now, and we've been discussing demand side flexibility for many years and seeing quite little development. But I don't think that it is because there's no willingness to change legislation, but it has to be much more aggressive and forward-looking than the efforts that we are doing now. And I do understand the constraints that system operators and regulators have. Security of supply is, of course, important and a cornerstone of the electricity system, and it's not nothing. So we do need to take careful steps in any changes to the legislation, but we cannot continue at this pace. In particular, if we remind ourselves of what our goals are in the medium and long term, the targets for decarbonization, we should assume that we are going to reach them, that we're going to introduce X amount of renewables in the system, but what is the cost associated to that? So given the current climate, inflation, instability, can we really ask consumers to continue bearing the costs of the energy transition. I think this is a very difficult question to pose to the regular consumer that is already bearing a lot of the additional costs due to the current situation. We have the tools and the opportunity to reduce the costs of this energy transition by using a clean, reliable, and already readily available technology, which is demand-side flexibility. So we should be cautious in the way that we take forward legislative changes, but we cannot wait for too long, because otherwise our energy transition is going to be extremely expensive and probably quite unpopular with consumers. So do we foresee any additional legislation necessary for this to happen? I mean, first and foremost, clean energy package needs to be fully implemented. And the steps that we're seeing right now, it hasn't been as smooth as expected. And since somebody was asking what the BRP is, I mean, just a small example, some countries are still requiring independent aggregators, which are the ones that are at a very good position to extract the benefits from demand-side flexibility. They're still being asked to reach agreements with the BRP of the customer suppliers. This is something that the clean energy package already clearly states that is not allowed, but it's still happening. It overcomplicates the process. It limits access to consumers. So clean energy package full implementation, this is the first step, of course, and it's also a responsibility of the European Commission to now oversee those states that are not reaching this level of implementation. It's been already a couple of years since it came into force. Why is this not happening? And then second, there are still, even if with full implementation, there are numerous aspects that are not covered by or insufficiently covered by the current electricity market design. And here I'm thinking of local flexibility markets, and the question was on what is actually local flexibility. We refer to that when we talk about procurement by distribution system operators of flexibility. So at transmission level, it's a bit more extended. At distribution level, it's barely existing. And I don't think this is because the electricity market design is not fully implemented. I think that it doesn't really cover the necessary aspects for that. And then the second point is that one of the constraints for flexibility is that, or for flexibility providers, is that there's not enough value streams open to create a business case for it. So we need, and this is something that the current legislation has not been able to do, is to allow the stacking of different value streams for flexibility providers. So, and then just finally, well, both these points, they are being considered, or they would fit perfectly in the development of a new network code for demand-side flexibility that we see as quite necessary and quite important to really move forward with the development. And to your response, and I think this is to your question on Acer's decision, I think what I'm saying is not, they're all aware of this, and this response from yesterday, I think, highlights that that regulators are now seeing that we're not properly valuing these resources in the existing legislation, not only in the existing legislation, but sorry, in the existing modeling exercises, which really dictate how the process goes for the next 10, 20 years. And this decision was very specifically on resource adequacy assessment, but I think the same can be said to the 10-year network development plans and other planning exercises. And at the end of the day,
sorry, Andres, can I just jump in there? So we're getting more questions coming in as we speak, and are running out of time. So I might just take the liberty of answering two related questions relatively quickly around why the UK should maximise investment in flexibility. I think largely the points that Anders has made about the benefits to consumers and society as a whole, and also that are we seeing cost mitigating effects of demand side flexibility in ancillary services. And in any market, the more supply you provide, the lower the cost is going to be, especially in these markets where you have a marginal clearing price, that the more low-cost assets that can participate in providing flexibility, the lower cost to consumers as a whole, and to the benefit to those who are participating. Another question came in fairly early for Lucy around Eastern Europe, and only 4% on the poll saw that as being a region which is expected to see growth. So Lucy, could I ask you, do you have any examples of countries where you see as being potential areas for growth?
I think the main one that jumps out is Poland, if we consider that technically Eastern Europe. It might be more Central Eastern. Primarily, they have a relatively progressive TSO that is planning on sort of staggering the accessibility and openness of demand side flexibility to the implementation of the coordinated markets. So that's looking at the region of 2023 and 2024. If we're looking more broadly at Eastern Europe, it really is this implementation of the coordinated markets, but it's likely to be the other side. So rather than preemptively taking the steps as Poland is doing to match it, it'll more likely be Europe has implemented the procedures, and those markets will join. I realise we're rapidly running out of time, but one other comment on Eastern Europe that's maybe not as clear in the maps is the CEP implementation of like energy communities and citizen energy communities. There's quite a high uptake in Eastern Europe on that. Limited amounts of participation at the moment, but it's definitely a positive step across the board in Eastern Europe to make the first steps into flexibility, even if TSO markets aren't fully open at the moment.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think this may be the last question that we have time for, but questions come in around the barriers for prosumers or consumers participating, with examples given data privacy and lack of knowledge. I'm wondering, Cinzia, if I could ask you to say a few words on what you found in the research in the barriers to flexibility.
Yes, it was already said before, the main barriers lay in regulatory barriers at the moment. Of course, there is a sort of lack of awareness in general for prosumers, but when the regulatory barriers are eliminated, it would be easier for prosumers and consumers in general to participate and provide their flexibility in the different markets. So really barrier number one is a regulatory one.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it just leaves me to thank the panelists, both for their contributions in the webinar today and over the last few months of collecting and preparing and analysing a vast amount of data. The Spain study is just one example of 12 where more data, more information, more analysis is available to SmartEn members and Delta EE subscribers. So I'd like to thank the audience, everyone who's attended. It's a great number again for this webinar. And I think, as we found, the discussion will carry on. There's a lot more progress to be made. Some questions we didn't get around to answering, and we will follow up as best we can to answer those questions. So I'd just like to say thank you all very much for attending today.